everyone. Welcome to the Oxford Martin School. My name is Charles Godfrey, and my only duty here, beyond welcoming you, is to introduce our Master of Ceremonies this evening, John Ingram.
Okay, Charles, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Master of Ceremonies is a grand title, but it's my real pleasure to welcome you all this evening to hear and to welcome colleagues who are online. I hope you are beaming in satisfactorily. This evening is really a conversation between two very eminent people, one of whom sitting here and the other one sitting there, who will join us in a moment.
We have a room full of them.
We've got a room full of them. There's lots of eminent people, that's quite right, yeah. But the first up, my good friend and colleague Tom Tomich is, as you may know, Distinguished Professor of Sustainability Science and Policy, UC Davis, and is founder of the Food Systems Lab at the university there. Tom and I, as I say, go back many years, but we first encountered each other really in the world of the CGIAR, the Consultative Group on International Ag in Kenya, working in agroforestry systems, that sort of stuff. Over that time, we've both got more and more involved in what we call food systems, but the subject tonight really is how we manage land to provide both sufficient food, but also maintain the ecosystem and the biodiversity and all the other things that we hold dear. It is a trade-off analysis, and how do we manage that is what we'll be talking about. Tom's interests are many. There's a great long list, but natural resource management, integrated ecosystem assessment, what else do you do? Land use change, things like that. Farming systems, food systems, value chains, sort of stuff we do in our group in the Environmental Change Institute. So tonight's talk is entitled Biodiversity and Food, Challenges and Opportunities to Win More or Lose Less. And I think that's a really nice way of framing it, because we have the choice. What do we want to win, and how do we balance those things? The list of things we want from our landscape, the list of things we want from our food system goes on and on and on, and it depends on your worldview what you have on that list. But it's absolutely the case that there are many opinions, there are many ideologies, but also there are many facts. And what's really important is to hang on to the knowledge base that we have and use that most effectively. So somebody else who's contributed massively to that knowledge base is Yadvinder Malhi, who's known to probably many of you in the room already, Professor of Ecosystem Science in the Environmental Change Institute, where my food system group lives. I'm Senior Research Fellow at Oriel. And Yadvinder's particularly interested in the functioning of the biosphere and its interactions with environmental change. Absolutely spot on for this topic. We've got many drivers of change, not least population demand. And while there is, of course, a lot of work to be done on managing demand from our food system, we've still got to nonetheless accept we need to increase production to some extent. And how do we do that without further damaging our natural resource base upon which so many things depend? So Yadvinder's focus, nature recovery and biodiversity restoration in the UK, but elsewhere, is going to be very relevant for this evening. So without further ado, let me invite Tom just to kick us off with a few thoughts, and then we'll invite Yadvinder to come and have that conversation. Then we'll have a chance to broaden out the conversation. Tom, over to you.
Thank you, John. Microphone live. I hope so. Well, greetings, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here in this beautiful place. And I just wanted to thank everybody who works here. Charles, the staff here is fantastic. I've spoken in a lot of places. I've never had such a supportive and effective group to work with. So well done for being in charge of all of this. And to thank John for inspiring me to do this, and Yadvinder for being here, and all of you. I've got a number of friends here in the audience and people that maybe will call out. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes. I'm going to turn on my timer right now, actually, because this is the sort of thing that one could actually go on and on about. I'm going to raise some questions. Yadvinder and I are going to have a discussion, and then we're going to open it up for everybody to have discussion. This is not a scientific seminar, as you're accustomed to here. It really is a more inductive approach. I'm going to put out some real-world examples, raise some questions, give you very few answers, but I hope we can find the answers together. This whole thing, I don't like double-headed arrows, but this is one of those cases where it really is appropriate. So never use more than one double-headed arrow in any analysis or it will blow up. But the idea of these two very broad things being sort of mutually conditioning, mutually affecting each other with feedbacks. We know that food and agriculture has had a major effect historically on habitat loss and loss of biodiversity. We also know that food and agriculture depends crucially on biodiversity. And then the other part, and John already touched on this, the idea of win more and lose less, that's a phrase that came from work that I was doing on tropical deforestation years ago, and everybody was looking for win-wins. By all means, if you fall over a win-win, grab onto it, do everything you can with it, but much of the world is not characterized by win-wins. So the idea of actually doing justice to either of these topics in 20 minutes is a fool's errand. I'm not going to try that. Instead, I'm going to have just 2 slides with a bit of self-promotion in a very shameless way. I'm the co-editor with Ashok Gadgil of the Annual Review of Environment and Resources. And our scope of our annual review covers all of the things we're talking about and a lot more. We work on, we have a rolling textbook idea that we strive to cover the entire scope of the environment and resources, so Earth life support systems, human use, governance, over a 5-year cycle. We have a very distinguished editorial committee who help us do all the work, including Yadvinder Malhi, who's served for more than 10 years now, coming to the end of his term. But Yadvinder has been an extraordinarily hardworking and productive member of the editorial committee. And importantly for people around the world, Annual Reviews has taken the step of making our journal open access, and not just the current issues, but back issues to the whole world for free. So if you have access to the internet, you can read our reviews. So let me just give you a tiny sampling within the areas of biodiversity and food of review articles, starting with none other than Malhi and Diaz, or Diaz and Malhi on biodiversity in the broadest sense. We also have reviews on mammals, mammal conservation. David McDonald here wrote a very challenging mammal conservation review in 2019, which Yadvinder, in many ways, David's review is kind of the precursor of our conversation here tonight. So it's great to have you here, David. We do a number of taxa. We do different biomes. We do different services. We're hoping to have pollination done next year. One area that I'm proud that we cover, which I'm going to give very short shrift to, is soil microbiology, soil microbiomes, which are, of course, a crucial part of the sustainability of agriculture and food systems. And another theme that we've had over the years in a number of reviews around the idea of human-wildlife conflict and coexistence. And I'll come back to that at the very end of what I'm talking about. And then, to be fair to my hosts, we also have in the current issue a food system resilience review by Monica Zurek and John Ingram. There's Monica in the back row. We should move you up. People need to get to know Monica. I think a lot of people know you, John. But bringing together the insights that are in that food system resilience with the kind of thinking about biodiversity and food systems, I think is a natural step, and I think it's very important that we kind of pursue that tonight. And then also a host of other things in food, including not just food and biodiversity, but also linking that to human health, which is, I know, of interest to people. So, now, let me just talk a little bit about some examples. I mentioned that I worked on tropical deforestation or efforts to conserve tropical forests some years ago. This is a map of Southeast Asia that you'll recognize. The dark green there is quote, forest, which is a contentious category anyway. But the gold is what we called working landscapes. And the two photographs are that the red dot is in northern Thailand, but it's representative montane systems. You also find them throughout Southeast Asia, and in fact, through the Congo Basin and into the Amazon, are these kinds of mixed landscape mosaics that mix patches of forest with various kinds of agricultural land uses, in fact, other things too, spiritual uses as well. So the takeaway from this is there's a lot of this stuff, and the second takeaway is you can't understand it just by looking at this cabbage patch or looking at this forest patch. The patchiness is part of the story. The interlinkages are part of the story. How these different patches fit into people's cultural and economic livelihoods are big parts of the story. So going to the next one. So the challenge, and I don't know, maybe you're ahead of us here at Oxford compared to where we are at the University of California. I've got a couple of UC colleagues in the room too. So apologies if Berkeley's already solved all this. But it's about moving from the heritage that goes back a couple centuries of looking at agricultural plots to thinking about working landscapes, how these things fit together. So if you're with me on that we have to think about these landscapes, I would offer a couple of axioms. So one is we have to think about multifunctionality. So it's not just about maize yields anymore. And the multiple functions go, there are multiple goals associated with functions, there are multiple land uses, and there are also multiple scales in time and space. So you get to complexity pretty fast. Another corollary of this is you have multiple stakeholders because different people put different weights on those different goals. In fact, some people may not even accept that some of those goals are valuable goals. So these are wicked problems. Another corollary I would assert is that these complexities make it impossible to manage these landscapes effectively in a purely administrative top-down structure. Even though it appears we continue to try. And then finally, and maybe this will be the most controversial statement, that effective local voice and appropriate incentives for local people are necessary, but not sufficient to achieve these local and the goals at local levels and other scales. Okay. So, I told you I was raising questions without giving a lot of answers. Let me move on. That was humid tropics. Now I'm going to go to my home state in California. So this is the Central Valley of California. It's arid and getting more arid. We're in the middle of, or I hope toward the end of, a 1,200-year drought. Sorry, of the worst drought in 1,200 years. I misspoke. But there is some water, and a lot of the biodiversity values tend to be associated with water, but not all of them. So seasonal wetlands. On the left, those are sandhill cranes, which are a listed endangered species on a park. So it's a park, a nature reserve. And I'm giving a bit of short shrift to parks and reserves. I think they're important, but I don't think they're enough. And the picture on the right is on a floodplain that's managed for rice production and also for conservation values. The parks that we have, particularly for the migratory birds, depend on that broader agricultural landscape for the effectiveness of the conservation. Moving to another one, looking at water again. Riparian corridors. This one is a creek that runs right next to the UC Davis campus. And this one is a case in which salmon runs. And another thing I'm giving short shrift to, a long list of things, is aquaculture and fisheries as food sources. But we finally, as of 3 years ago, had salmon migrations coming up this creek again, which sounds wonderful. I was standing down there, I heard this giant animal splashing around in the water, and foolishly I ran toward it, and it was a big salmon, and there were a bunch more. That all sounds wonderful. It probably had been at least a generation, if not two, that salmon had not been able to get to that point in the creek. So how do you do that? It requires negotiating with people downstream this creek had actually been cut off from the river. You've got to reestablish that connectivity over a scale of 30 to 50 kilometers with people who probably couldn't care less about salmon. They want to have the water for their rice fields. So the same rice fields I mentioned over there, also the rice fields that are involved in this. The lower picture is the San Joaquin River with water in it again. It was dry for many years. The part of the story here is that it took 30 years of litigation. If you want to make a lot of money in California, become a water lawyer. Okay. It took 30 years of litigation to achieve this environmental outcome. Okay. The point being that these wonderful things we talk about at the relatively local scale often involve all kinds of social, legal, and institutional actions at much larger scales. And then finally, annual hedgerows. John took me on a wonderful walk around the Cotswolds on the weekend, and I see hedgerows everywhere. In the county where I live, we used to have lots of hedgerows. They all sort of went away. The idea is how to get them back. One of those, the one on the left, that's actually, is a farm that makes money growing seed for hedgerows. The main demander of those seeds is what we call Caltrans, so it's our highway department. So it's a public policy decision to bring those species back along our roadways. And then the one on the right with the truck in the background is an experiment on one of our research sites for habitat for pollinators. So those are annual hedgerows. But neither of these hedgerows happen automatically because of market forces. In fact, market forces, just like in the humid tropics, market forces often tend to run things the other way. So talking about markets, I've been working for a number of years with Barilla, the Italian food company, and Barilla is interested in sustainability of its raw material sourcing. So they've come up with various checklists. So I work with the agronomist at Barilla, but they got together with the marketing people at Barilla, and I don't know if you can see that or if you can guess at what Italian is. I think it's pretty obvious, but it basically says that in this package of cookies, which is what they call a love food, which is a very appealing phrase in Italian, but it means every little kid in Italy eats this stuff. So they put all these bugs and bees and flowers on these, and as part of their sustainability program, they require the people who grow wheat for these cookies to keep at least 3% of their fields in flowers that are Italian flowers that promote bees. Okay. So it's a bit interesting. I mean, out of the 10 dimensions, I've spent a lot of time saying, no, we can't just look at one thing at a time. And I was very upset with the Economist cover about ESG, if you saw that, and it's like, no, we can't even worry about 3 things. We've only got to worry about one thing. Well, I could be wrong about that from a marketing point of view. This was already the most popular cookie among kids in Italy. After they put the bees on it, it increased its market share significantly. So who am I to say? Okay, so finally, let me just check my time. Oh, I'm doing okay. Probably too easy a question. Anybody here guess what state in the United States this picture's in? That's what I was expecting people to say. It's somebody said it, except it's a trick question. So this is in California, close to the Oregon border. But if you go and visit ranchers up there, some of them, I don't know what proportion, will say, no, they're not in California at all. They've declared this independent state that they call Jefferson. I don't do that to mock them or stereotype them, but just to say they feel quite disconnected from San Francisco and Washington, D.C. So this is a cattle ranch now in California. Most people who live in California probably would not be aware that even that these kinds of systems exist in California to this day. These ranches, many of them go back multiple generations. The ancestors wiped out wolves and also grizzly bears. There's still other kinds of bears. So the grizzlies have not come back, but gray wolves have come in over those mountains from Oregon. And the cattle folk here don't like having the gray wolves around. And there is a mystique about wolves. It turns out that it's fairly rare for people, humans, to be attacked by wolves. It's even rarer for a wolf to kill somebody, although it has been documented. But what wolves do is they attack cattle, and especially calves, and sheep, and other animals, and the ranchers lose money. The wolves only reappeared, I should say, after two human generations of being absent. They reappeared about 2015, and resident packs were documented in 2019. The state has started a compensation program for ranchers who lose livestock to wolves, but the ranchers think it just too much paperwork and not enough payment. So people are not satisfied with the compensation level. So I'm at my last slide now. Oops. Oh yeah, so I was just saying, honeybees are one thing, wolves are quite another from the point of view of local people. So this is the last slide before Yadvinder will now tell you all the answers to these questions. But, so in terms of major challenges, of course we have many major challenges, but I wanted to put forward this point about multifunctionality, which I hope you accept as uncontroversial in these complex landscapes. And the more challenging point is, how do we create an effective and just balance between local and national and international and planetary interests in various kinds of existence of biodiversity and also ecosystem services? And this is a challenge that spans from when I worked in Indonesia and the work that I've been doing with Pepa and Manta there, to California, my home state. And we could use more scientific evidence, but I think equally important is the question of values and ethical principles and developing some kind of shared sense. I actually am coming to the point that thinking that we need to get more explicit about these values and principles as a way forward. And then the other side, which maybe, I was thinking about the University of California when I wrote these things up, so I don't know if they're relevant for Oxford or not, but it's the idea of we need a shift in paradigm academically, intellectually, from the kind of productionism, at least that we see in land-grant public universities in the United States, about the way to solve problems is raise yields, make a bigger pile of, you name it, rice, maize, whatever, to thinking about these landscapes as coupled social and ecological systems. One challenge with that, of course, is it's a lot easier to get people excited about a bigger pile of rice or maize than it is. People tend to, except maybe in this room, get bored when you start talking about coupled systems and systems. But then the question is, what are the implications for university programs, for how we design our research, which may be relevant here, for what kind of partnerships we need with communities. I already raised the point about our work with Barilla, and we can talk about some of that experience. What do we need to think about in terms of our partnership with private companies? Do we need new courses and degrees to be able to do this? I need new skills. I do. So what are the knowledge and skills that are needed? And so I promised you lots of questions. I'm going to stop there. Exactly.
Okay, thank you, Tom. There's lots of points to think about. Before I kick off a conversation, I thought I'd spend a minute or two just describing what we're trying to do in the Leverhulme Centre, which aligns very strongly with many of the things here. So
This is telling me to stop talking.
So the Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery is a 10-year programme that has just started this year in June, and many of the people in this audience are already involved in various aspects of that. And the challenge we've set ourselves is to look at what it takes to deliver nature recovery at scale, in a way that's both effective but also socially inclusive and just. And that's a huge challenge. And whether if we solve that in 10 years, that would be phenomenal. But I think integral to that, of course, is reconciling nature recovery with the food system and how we can feed the world while also not only maintain and protect biodiversity, but restore and enhance biodiversity in landscapes where it's severely depleted. And the UK is a key example of that. And so our work is half our focus is on the UK in terms of what we can do here, and the other half is in the global south, where we'll work on a range of case study landscapes. One that's particularly advanced is around the cocoa landscapes of Ghana, but we're also looking in Southeast Asia and South America and other contexts. So many of the points that you raised, Tom, are certainly points that were key for us to think about this challenge of landscapes and how they can provide and resolve these potential tensions between nature recovery and the food system. So in terms of your overall challenges there, I'd say, so if you turn focus to the UK first, I'd say in some ways, at least in terms of official policy declarations, and some here may agree or disagree with me on this, the central policy has made part of that paradigm shift. So what we're hearing with a lot of contestation from the government is that farming is about public goods, one of which is for food provision, but there's a whole range of public goods like biodiversity and water and things that need to be provided by that. And so in some ways that purely protectionist mindset has shifted a bit in terms of central policy.
Hooray!
Whether it's successful, we'll see. It's certainly contested. We almost lost it about a couple of months ago, and it seems to be back on the agenda now. I think, but I think where we're struggling is perhaps now the second point there at this level of working out the balance between essential policy directives that are contested, and then also a range of actors in local landscapes. Some of them are very excited and enthusiastic about moving forward. Some of them are very suspicious about changes to the economic models, the incentives that farmers are given there. And one of the, and I think, so one of the challenges that you raised there is finding consensus in these landscapes. We can't find consensus because people are always disagreeing on that. But how do we move forward with this shared set of values and goals where the basic values that people see in land and landscapes are contested? And I wonder whether you have any insights from your experiences of what are the strategies of finding at least enough consensus to move forward rather than it being a continuous battleground.
Yeah, well, this is the winning more and losing less part, right? Those differences in interests are always going to be there. They're kind of baked in. I do think that, well, number one, meeting people where they are. So going out and experiencing with people the kinds of challenges they're facing, or even on the policy side or on the business side, developing relationships to be able to have mutual trust. And also, I mentioned that the values, because I think it is surprising that people can actually agree on values. And I've had this experience all over the world. If you ask people, well, about this piece of land, what do you think? They often phrase it in terms of their grandchildren, that they would want to create something that would go forward for multiple generations. And so I guess I'm congenitally an optimist, but I have been surprised if to step out of the kind of battles we seem to get stuck into. And I know that the Martin School is a leader in scenarios and foresight kinds of work in a way we need more of. But one of the things I've found, and it's work that I've done with Monica over the years too, that if we talk with people about the future, it's easier for people to agree, and it's easier for people to step out of this polarization. I'm not saying it always works, but I've seen it work.
Okay, and one of the points you raised was also between top-down and local. And one thing that was quite striking, you made the comment that local action is necessary but not sufficient. You need this coupling between the top-down and the bottom-up. How can that be? What are the effective ways to get that coupling as well, to not be so driven by the centre?
Well, and there's also, the 21st century dilemma is how big a scale can we work on things? And we have the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, and I really worry about the ability to deal with these questions at the global scale, even though climate change, biodiversity loss the whole planet has a stake in these things. And I've found it much more productive to try to do these kinds of consultations and scenarios and foresights at the scale of, well, it's like your work here in Britain, John, or we tend to work in California as a unit. And I'll tell you why I think that matters. It's because instead of having somebody who's a middle-level official of the Department of Agriculture or the Ministry of Agriculture, Environment, Food, and Rural Affairs here, you can have a farmer or a rancher at the table at those kinds of scales. And if we're looking for solutions, you've got to have the people who are using and doing in the conversation. So I think there's some big gaps in how we think about governing the global commons, and we see that. And I think we've got a lot more success and a lot more track record at sort of subnational or regional scales. Mm-hmm. Not to say we should be satisfied with that, but maybe we should put more effort into that.
Yeah, I certainly think this scale is the key challenge, that at one level, local contingency matters so much, and in understanding the particular context of land and place.
Yeah.
But the risk is that if you're too contingent, everything becomes a boutique project. That's very nice there.
Well, let me react to that. But then, so we're talking about spatial scale. There's also temporal scale. And I think we often underestimate how much time, when people really disagree about wicked problems, how much time it takes to actually build trust and build a shared language to actually be able to come up with some kind of workable solutions, but on the boutiqueness. So is sustainability a science, or is it just a one-off project everywhere? And I mentioned the work that I've been doing with Pippa Amanta, who's here. So that's in Indonesia. And there's a kind of a cycle of, you have to build a shared understanding, you have to decide on what the interventions are going to be, various things, you have to decide how to measure them and how to enforce. And at each of those stages, there's a ton of things that can go wrong. People can sabotage them in many ways. And one of our colleagues, who is known to some of you, Meineva Nordvig, kind of summarized these steps for Indonesia. So people can sabotage it, they can pretend they don't understand. And so he put together this model, which we could dredge up, but I have it on a slide. But those steps and those barriers and those pitfalls were almost exactly identical to the issues that we face in California. Mm-hmm. You can imagine two more different. So yes, context matters, culture matters, history matters, but in terms of getting from A to Z on these steps, I do think that we can learn from comparative studies how to do it better, faster, more effectively. I really do believe that.
There's a whole range of questions coming in, so I feel like there's going to be...
Well, and we should make sure we have enough time.
I think I may actually open this up for questions from the audience first, and then some from here. Charles, do you want to kick off?
Thanks, Tom. That was great.
Thank you, Charles.
I wanted to ask you about narratives. So a lot of people have argued that one of the ways one can try and reconcile some of the differences between different stakeholders, not all of them, is by shared narratives. And certainly in this country, this side of the Atlantic, there is less of the correlation between the political left and right and pro and anti-environment. So I was interested in your and Yadvinder's view about the value of explicitly developing narratives and the role of the academia in doing that, and the difference between what happens here and in a much more polarized political economy situation in the United States.
Although I will say that yesterday's midterm is also an example of winning more and losing less. At least I'm revealing my biases. But that's a great question. Yadvinder, is it okay if I go first?
Go ahead.
So I was slow to come around to this idea of storytelling. And so I did see it, though, working in the tropics, that people, it's how people construct the time frame of what they're trying to do. And it's not so much about me constructing narratives, it's about me actually listening to narratives and documenting them. And now returning to my home state in California, you may have heard, we've had these many horrific things associated with the drought, including these wildfires that are almost unimaginably terrible. And the native Californian people, of which there are a few left, had land management practices that involved the book about their land. About a third of it is about the use of fire as a management tool. And we're sort of discovering that our peak fire year in California was 2 years ago. And the best evidence we have is what was our worst fire year in terms of extent was a fairly typical fire year in terms of native Californian management practices. But of course, fuel loads, the forests were completely different. So when they were burning that area for their own management objectives, they didn't have the kind of intensity of fires that we're getting now. We've learned about those practices because those narratives are now, we've stopped to listen to those narratives, and people are starting to pick that up. So yeah, is there a power in narrative? Absolutely. And I think it's about, we have a lot of kind of artificial silos or divisions in society and in universities along disciplinary lines, but also, say, between the sciences and the humanities. Bringing humanistic perspectives, arts and humanities, into our work on the environment, I think, is really important. So great question. Yadvinder, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'd say, so thinking about the UK context, I think narrative is incredibly powerful, the potential that it has there. So what we've seen, say, in the last decade in the UK is very strong narratives emerging, not necessarily completely shared narratives, but we've had nature writers like Rob McFarlane and others, really evocative in their description of the landscape and the nature and the state of it. We've had positions that were quite radical, and are still quite radical, like rewilding, coming through into the mainstream as a story that I think, partially because it's a story rather than an intervention, it's actually something about empowering, not just rewilding landscapes, but also rewilding people's sense of their place in the world as well. And I think that narrative certainly carries a lot of people, has brought more interest into thinking about nature. But at the same time, that's also a narrative that's alienated a lot of people and changed their sense or threatened their sense of their connection to land as well. And so I think the challenge is to develop narratives that are powerful but also not polarizing and dividing society. And that can be a challenge, and perhaps nature recovery, perhaps as an umbrella in this particular context, is something that carries nuance in it, and the types of how can we deliver food and replenish biodiversity from its quite depleted state, which I think very few people disagree with on that, and bring that together. So I think the challenge, narratives are certainly important and powerful. How can we come up with something that at least is a shared narrative in this context?
I have to mention two things, if I may. So ecofeminism, or feminist ecology, talks about imaginaries, which I think it's a related concept to when we talk about scenarios and foresight, but I think we need to take that body of research more seriously. We actually have a review this year in the annual review of environment and resources about ecofeminism and those methods. And I've commissioned a review for next year on science fiction and the environment, which is a different kind of narrative. But how many here have read Kim Stanley Robinson's book, The Ministry for the Future? Okay, not as many as I would have expected. He's a Davis-based science fiction writer, so maybe that's why. But Barack Obama read it. It's about 400 pages long, but if you put it beside the summary for policymakers that IPCC puts out, I used to be a big fan of those things. The first time I saw one of those things, I thought, yeah, this is what we all have to do. But now, after you've been through several iterations, you have to have read all of them to make sense out of the current one. And 400 pages from Kim Stanley Robinson had much more effect on me than that summary for policymakers. I hate to say. I suppose that's a bit of anathema, but.
Okay, we'll take another one. David. Is
there a microphone?
It's coming. It's
on my way,
David.
Speeding along. Tom, you raised the interesting case of the return of the wolves to Northern California, and I was going to use that to make a comment on the different angles from which I think one needs to look at these coexistence problems. Because I think what the wolves bring into focus in California and like predators elsewhere is a sort of intersection between economic problems and the need for a good economic instrument to incentivize a solution, culture, and also something less commonly thought about, which is biological adaptations. So you mentioned that the current solution involved compensation and that the ranchers found it unsatisfactory. I'm not in the tiniest bit surprised, because I think worldwide compensation payments have turned out to be so readily corrupted, and to leave the problem as a blight and as a punitive thing to be borne rather than an asset, that in general they're being replaced by the whole family of payments for ecosystem services, or particularly payments to encourage cooperation. So have some wolves pupping on your ranch and you get paid, they're an asset. But the second point I wanted to make very quickly there is that although that sounds nice when you say it quickly, and has worked in quite a diversity of cases around the world, much better than compensation, and provides an incentive, including in common agricultural payments when we were once members of the common market in this country. I believe that a very revealing piece of work was done with the attitudes of Laplanders to wolverines and wolves that prey on their reindeers in the north of Scandinavia. And there's doubtless people in the room who know more of the detail than I, but the short version was that while wolverine numbers have increased greatly because there's a payment if you have wolverine dens on your land, wolf numbers haven't, because they simply haven't printed enough money to make it culturally acceptable to have a wolf on your land. And I think that, in a sense, tracks back to then biological adaptation, and wolves, being canids, are so marvelously opportunistic that they can really cause trouble, whatever you do. And so then you find yourself talking about a societal choice which says regulation either we have wolves or we don't, and somebody has to enforce that. Right. So I just wanted to say there's different dimensions to that sort of problem, and I think those Californian wolves rather illustrate that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, and I'll just say, so David and I met for the first time this morning, although we had corresponded, and there's another thing. So there used to be a technology transfer model of development that people from places like the University of California and Oxford would go and tell people how to do things. And I've been increasingly finding that technology transfer, the South-North, is some of the institutional and policy solutions that have been developed in Africa and Asia. We're actually trying to bring them to California. So I'm looking forward to learning from David about how we might adapt this. And yes, it is cultural. There's an added bit, which is those ranchers graze their cattle on public lands as well as their own private lands. And most of the cattle-wolf interactions happen on the public land, the national forest land, not on the private land. So there's layers and layers of complexity to this.
There's a precise parallel with lions and Kenya.
Okay, all right.
Okay, I think I'll alternate with some of the online questions, just
Yes.
to share some of those. So Josie Isque says, is there any solid evidence showing them how modern farming methods with high input of fertilizers and pesticides, like typical monocropping, are more either productive or profitable than other approaches such as regenerative, organic, and ecological? So the role of yield in modern versus, industrial versus regenerative approaches.
Yeah, I'd rather not use it. Modern is a little bit, but I think I understand the question. Mm-hmm. So many people have tried to answer this, and the answers have tended to be kind of ideologically driven. And I would say, when we did a study about, quote, organic versus conventional, one of the conclusions, and this was also published in the annual review, one of the conclusions was you have to take it commodity by commodity. So wheat is different from lettuce, and so it's very difficult to generalize. But then the other thing is, if you look at how, at least in the United States, research money goes to different things, we've had, 100 years or more. Well, let's just say 50 years. So the hockey stick, kind of this post-World War II period, has been very heavily favoring the chemical inputs and those kinds of things. And the work on aspects of what we'll call organic has been a trivial amount of funding. So you have to kind of do the thought experiment. If you'd had the same amount of effort to look at those other systems, and I think systems is the key word, we might have very different playing field. But the conclusion of that review of conventional versus organic, the subtitle was, is this a useful distinction? And the answer was not really. That the important distinction is between thinking about systems versus thinking about things in a reductionist way. So, I mean, maybe that doesn't answer in a neat, tidy way, but I do think that we really need to change our paradigm in thinking. And I'm not saying that we suddenly have to stop using all synthetic fertilizers, for example. The work, actually from TSBF in Kenya, was that for very nutrient-starved soils, that a mix of a small amount of organic and a small amount of synthetic nutrients was actually the best combination. But we're talking about these are administered in teaspoon amounts, not the kind of levels that you'd find in California's Central Valley. Our nutrient cycle is completely out of balance in the Central Valley of California, so that's because of use of nitrogen fertilizer and because we don't manage manure well. So we can't keep going with business as usual.
I'll take a question from the
And there was a hand early, way back. I think you were, I saw you as part of the last round. I'm sorry I don't know your name. Is it okay if we?
Go ahead, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Coming in round this way.
And I'll rely on you to get some from mine.
Yes, yeah.
Thanks so much for speaking with us. And I know in one of your slides you talked about the tension between creating an effective, or creating a balance that is both effective and just, and balances local and national interests. And I know you said you're not here to give us answers necessarily, but I wonder if you might have an example of where you've seen that work well, and specifically to the justice piece, who gets to decide the parameters of justice and then implement it in whichever example you share. Thanks very much.
Well, that's a very profound question. Thank you. So what I've seen in tropical forestry is if things are really unjust, they're not going to be effective anyway, right? One of the things I love about studying people in various places is that human beings have this wonderful capacity to subvert authority. So that's why I said it was necessary but not sufficient to consider local use. So environmental justice, social justice have belatedly become very front and center in discussion in California agriculture. And you asked for an example of where things work. So we did do this 7-year assessment of the nitrogen cycle in California, which I said is way out of whack, like way, way out of whack. Now, and the main thing is not climate forcing, and it's not nitrate pollution of surface water, it's groundwater pollution. And so if you're pumping groundwater for your almond orchard and it's got nitrates in it, that's actually a plus, right? You buy less fertilizer. But if you're pumping water and using it for domestic use, that's a public health threat. And it turns out that the people who are most exposed to that contaminated water are poor communities that didn't have municipal water extended to them, and they have shallow wells, and they're drinking this dangerous water. So we figured out that problem. We also figured out, some colleagues at UC Davis figured out that it would cost about $150 million to extend these safe water to these communities. $150 million sounds like a lot of money. In the world of water in California, where most things start at a price ticket of about 10 billion. Should have said 10 billion. When we presented that to farmers, they were like, well, let's just get it done. The farmers didn't pay for it. They convinced the governor to pay for it, but it still got done. So I consider that a step towards some kind of justice.
Okay, I'll take another one from online. Yeah? So this is from Catherine Allen. How can we engage with and get meaningful buy-in or action on the importance of agroecology as a mainstream approach to food systems transformation from those organizations and states that are invested in the status quo, such as big corporates? Without this, we will simply be talking at the fringes.
And how do we avoid greenwash and lip service? I mean, that's also the... I've had more experience working with government agencies and trying to get them, like working with the Department of Forestry in Indonesia, who had, because of training and culture, they thought of particular forestry practices, like the way you manage German forests or British forests, or the way forests should be managed in the tropics. And this is where science has a role, because we were able to measure the various dimensions from kind of biodiversity, livelihoods, carbon, and show that those, quote, indigenous systems were actually superior to the silvicultural systems. And that was one of those win-wins. We couldn't have done that without having strong rapport with the local communities, who had to show us and explain to us how they actually did these things and give us access to their land. And so we produced these measures, and they actually, the local communities used those measures in their negotiation with the Forest Department, and the Indonesian government used those measures in their negotiation with international organizations. So there are times when information can help. With companies, I don't have a quick fix for that. I'll say this. I am very selective in which companies I work with. And actually I learned this, I mentioned Barilla. This was the idea that came from the agronomists at Barilla, that we should explicitly write down our values that underpin this idea and see whether those values were aligned. And I found that just blew my mind how that worked. And so if people are willing to do that, and if you have enough of a rapport, but it's not one of these things where you just, I mean, a lot of science, or how can I say it? Kind of the stereotype of science is we'll fill knowledge gaps, right? We'll do the research, we'll take the results, we'll show them to the people in industry or people in government, and they'll say, oh my gosh, if I'd only known, I would have behaved. We got to get away from that knowledge gap model, but there are other ways to work it.
I think where the question was coming from is whether big ag is part of the solution, or is it a vested interest that blocks transformation of the system? So just with the analogy with climate change, is big oil and it's just part of a blockage.
So the answers are yes and yes. So, for example, organically certain. So organic in the United States is an administrative category. It's not a purely scientific category. But there's some science that underpins it. And about 5% of California agriculture is certified organic. But the existence of organic has influenced the behavior of many conventional growers. They look at each other. And then there are many conventional growers who switch back and forth, or they might grow organic processing tomatoes and conventional processing tomatoes, and it's very price sensitive. So I'm not sure I answered the question, but I'm not sure I have an answer for the question.
Okay, great. We'll take some more from the audience then.
I think it's you.
Just getting his microphone.
Yeah. If you have the microphone, that means it's you.
I really like what you said about narratives, the importance of narratives, and greater dialogue between the sciences and the social sciences and humanities. And in the time I've spent in ecological science, one thing that I've tried to understand and work through is finding ways for scientific models to attend more fully to the complexities and the interconnections of ecological processes. And I've found that there are barriers to that on many levels in any model. And the most obvious are kind of on the technical or the algorithmic level, but then it feels like there are actually some much deeper philosophies that underpin how and why these models are used that feel like they limit them a lot. So one example is in a lot of the mathematical modeling of animal behavior or animal movement, there's an assumption that an animal responds to the landscape in a kind of cost-benefit, rational choice, economic way. And I've wondered if other narratives or like cultural understandings of non-human behavior, or just the agency and the way that ecosystems operate can kind of help inform shifting some of the deeper ideologies that maybe are a little bit ossified in ecological models. But I would be curious to hear your thoughts on finding ways, and perhaps I feel like interdisciplinary conversation is so fundamental here, but finding ways of developing ecological mathematical models that can better attend to these, I guess, more anthropological factors which inevitably play a part because humans are involved in all of this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you in large part. I'm not sure that developing comprehensive mathematical models should be our end goal. I tend to use more mixed methods and a more inductive approach. And Monica will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in the scenarios world, the record of usefulness of essentially participatory scenarios where things, sure, there are some consistency checks, but things are much more open rather than mathematically driven, expert-driven scenarios, that former set of techniques has proven to be more useful in terms of thinking creatively. And you can see why, right? It's not stuck on the railroad tracks of history. And so I tend to think that, well, John, I know in your group you do this too, and I think on Saturday the exercise is going to be about more of a mixed methods or more of a visualization kind of approach, that we start there. And we've found, as we're trying to think through what would a sustainable transformation look like, that there are no photographs that exist of that you really need to work with people and to work with the artists to be able to even get a visual to communicate about it. So there's no place you can go to take a picture. Did that help?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think I also...
2 seconds. People online can't hear us.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, that resonates with what I thought as well, because, yeah, I don't feel like just increasing the sophistication or complexity of some model is going to do much, but actually reframing the objectives of a model to fit better with understandings of, as you say, what artists can or anthropologists can provide a fuller picture with.
Yeah.
But it just seemed, yeah, I guess in the models I'd encountered, it seemed like they were so separated from being in conversation with people from different kinds of thinking.
I totally agree with you on that. In economics, we have this whole platitude that all models are wrong, but some are useful. So that sounds kind of cheeky, but the point is sometimes models are very useful in revealing some structural connections, and certainly in the kinds of systems we're talking about. Or, I mean, we would be nowhere in understanding global climate without models. So I'm not anti-model, I'm just more selective about models.
I tend to think of models as formalizations of the way we think of a system, and that can lead to mathematical formalization, but there are many other ways of formalizing that. And part of that is thinking about what's in that system that you're including and what's excluded in that system, whether it's other perspectives or worldviews.
Or people talk about interacting with sort of abstract with experiential, right? So different ways of knowing being complementary. I mean, I guess that's part of the flavor of what you're talking about doing with some of the landscapes here.
Thank you. So we'll take a few more. Iqbal?
Great questions, by the way.
So this is a much simpler one. You talked about Barilla and your relationship with this biscuit manufacturer. And by the sounds of it, they had shared values and they were proactively looking for ways to improve the biodiversity in their supply chains. I mean, they had access to you and you had in your mind clearly this list of things they should have been looking at. What was the main reason they didn't?
They didn't what? I'm sorry?
That they only did the bees and not this list that you had in your mind.
So if you go online, you'll find that from the agronomic point of view, they have 10 different issues that they consider, of which which bees, actually its habitat is one for bees. So the agronomists are thinking about this whole system. It was the marketing people who said, we're going to put a bee on the package. And I'm really lousy at figuring out which of those 10 things to put on the package, right? And some people are really good at it. I think it's probably a good idea that they've got bees on the package. By the way, the wheat doesn't need the bees to pollinate it, right? The bee, and I asked them about, they all know this, they're signaling a commitment to pure existence values. It is the biodiversity value. It's not a utilitarian thing. But that's what what appeals to people. That hit the nerve for who's ever buying cookies for those little kids in Italy. So this raises some interesting questions for me about how these things work within companies, how academics engage. How should we be thinking about this kind of selective presentation of evidence? I don't know. Does that address what you were asking about? So they're worried about soil carbon. They're worried about all the stuff we would list. But it's this mystery of the point of sale for consumer packaged goods that even the big food companies tell me at that moment where people decide about what to buy, they claim they don't completely understand that. I'm not sure I'm completely convinced that they don't completely understand, but that's what they say.
Okay,
There was a
Martha, you had a question?
Yeah.
So this question, I guess, kind of follows on from that. You've spoken about working with companies. You've talked about working with government agencies and so on. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about what you see the role of academia in this very applied problem, and if you see any change from how academia has worked traditionally, and how applied do you think it should be?
So there are different schools of thought in this kind of use-inspired or use-driven research about maintaining the boundaries between academia and practice. And so there's actually a whole literature about boundary spanning, which is really quite interesting. And it turns out that it's not easy to do it right. And it also turns out that governance of the research program, so who's on the, I don't know, do you have an advisory committee for the?
We're in the process of having one, yes.
Well, so who's on that committee is super important. And it's fair, there's a whole art to define. I kind of became obsessive about this when I was building an institute. So there's one school of thought, and I apologize, I could go on and on. I wish I could just say yes or no to this one. But there's one school of thought that you don't want policy or private to infect science, and you don't want to scientize politics either, right? However, last term for doctoral students, I did a course with an attorney and an engineer, which was about using social media for advocacy of science, of climate change solutions. And I did that because I felt that what we had been doing of staying on this side of the boundary was no longer sufficient. Yeah. So it's something I think we all need to do a lot of soul searching about. It's like, are you just going to put the honeybee on your cookie packet, your biscuit package, or you're going to put all the information on there?
Okay, I think we'll take one more from the audience. Yoram?
Is there anybody online?
No, I think.
Hi.
In the beginning of the discussion, you said that you mainly believed in more small-scale solutions and not sort of the real large global scale solutions. So nevertheless, if this should have an effect, it has to be multiplied, or the small-scale project has to go beyond the case study scale up. So what do you think is the sort of the main hurdles to to go beyond the case study scale on this.
So I might not have been clear. I mean, the reason why I showed that map of Southeast Asia with all those gold dots on it was I was trying to convey that even though the operational scale is a hectare or two, that there are millions of hectares that I think of that as a significant scale. That we have to understand what's going on at the operational unit to understand what's going on throughout that whole landscape. I do think it's really important, again, it's back to systems thinking. You want to make sure that if you're trying to develop solutions, that what you're working on at a kind of a technical level to work on the details in the context of implementation is actually going to have broad applicability. So in the CGIAR, there used to be a term for this, which was something like adoption domains, or it was just that you want to make sure that you're solving problems that many people would benefit from. So I don't think it's, I think in agricultural science, people sometimes fall into the trap of, okay, I'm going to solve this very narrow problem, and then we'll figure out how to make a way to make it relevant for many people. I think you have to start with the relevance filter first, and then figure out how to solve the problem. Does that help?
Yeah, well.
It's not, I realize it's not the answer to your question, but I think I frame it a little differently.
I think that the difference between working on a small scale is that you can consider the multifunctionality and the different stakeholders and that, while if you go to the governmental level, they are sort of turning on some buttons like increasing or decreasing the taxes, which is a quite crude way of sort of satisfying different different stakeholders in the local communities.
Yeah, but let's calibrate a little bit. It turns out that in terms of land area, the island of Sumatra and my home state of California are roughly the same size. Would you consider the island of Sumatra or the state of California as small?
Well, I would consider California as relatively large scale.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of, I mean, personally, that's how I think about it.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. I'll just wrap up with the final question now. So thanks for giving those insights. So I'd ask you, what's in your ideal vision you would see, say, you could pick a landscape, whether it's Indonesia or California, what that landscape could look like in 20 years' time? And then also, realistically, what are the main barriers to getting there in your assessment?
So I think the main barriers are the organizations and institutions and awareness in people to be able to develop collaborative solutions. And so here's the true confession, right? We've been talking with the government of Indonesia, with the coordinating Ministry for Economic Affairs, about how to change the paradigm for landscape management in Indonesia and what kind of investments in social capital, physical capital, and things that need to make. And then in California, for completely separate reasons, I'm involved with a process of land use planning where there's all these institutions for participatory behavior, participation, and lots of lawyers too. And I feel very conflicted because I wouldn't wish the California situation on Indonesia at all. So I do think that it is about investing in some kind of collective discovery of solutions. So I don't see a particular landscape. I see capabilities of people to co-create solutions, which is why I kind of hit in that slide was hitting what are the institutional challenges for society and for universities.
Okay, great.
Well, thanks very much. It was such a pleasure.
Tom and Yadvinder, thank you.
Thank you, Yadvinder.
It's a wide range of issues and ideas you've discussed and helped us think about. I think, to my mind, this multifunctionality begs the question from whose viewpoint? And this is where we need the institutions with a small I, the social institutions as well as the obvious ones. And you've also talked about the importance of spatial and temporal dimensions, but then there is also, of course, jurisdictional scale, and who has the power, who has the authority, who has the moral authority to instigate a new way of managing an area of land. And I think those are interesting questions as well.
Especially because they don't fit together.
Well, the asynchrony of time and action and space with the complication of jurisdictional or lack of jurisdictional governance is, I think, a big challenge. But nonetheless, what you've shown, I think, is examples of where multifunctionality is existing, and it has existed for many years in some of those places, and it seems pretty stable. Is everybody getting what they want? No, because there are lots of different people wanting different things. That's the game. Yadvinder, thank you so much for joining the conversation, and Tom for being part of this evening. Thank you all for coming. Let's close the evening now and see you all another time. Thank you to the Institute.